Something historic happened on the night of March 3rd, 2026. For the first time in the modern era, United States military forces participated in a land operation against drug cartel infrastructure on South American soil. It was not a declaration of war in the traditional sense. There was no congressional vote, no formal address to the nation from the Oval Office. Instead, a terse announcement appeared on the social media feed of U.S. Southern Command, SOUTHCOM, the combatant command responsible for all American military activity in Latin America and the Caribbean. The statement read in part, "On March 3rd, Ecuadorian and U.S. military forces launched operations against designated terrorist organizations in Ecuador." 11 words that marked the crossing of a threshold that American foreign policy had for decades carefully avoided. To understand what happened in Ecuador, you have to understand how the United States arrived at this moment, because this was not a sudden decision. It was the culmination of a campaign that began quietly in August 2025, when the Trump administration began deploying Navy warships and personnel to the Caribbean Sea, citing the need to combat drug cartels. At the time, the move was framed as an extension of counter-narcotics operations. Within weeks, however, the scale and lethality of what was being planned became undeniably clear. On September 2, 2025, President Trump announced that the U.S. Navy had carried out its first airstrike in the Caribbean, targeting a vessel the administration alleged was operated by narco-terrorists. All 11 men aboard were killed. Trump released video of the strike. The operation had a name, Operation Southern Spear, and it announced itself to the world with a fireball on the open ocean. U.S. Southern Command said the campaign's declared mission was to detect, disrupt, and degrade transnational criminal and illicit maritime networks. Critics, including the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, said something far more troubling was unfolding. A series of extrajudicial killings on the high seas with no due process, no independent verification of targets, and no mechanism for accountability. By February 2026, Operation Southern Spear had produced a staggering operational ledger. At least 44 strikes had been carried out on 45 vessels, 14 in the Caribbean Sea, 29 in the Eastern Pacific, and 2 in unspecified locations. At least 151 people had been killed. The military assets employed were drawn from the full spectrum of American naval and aerial power. Navy surface warships provided the operational platforms. Unmanned aerial systems, drones, conducted persistent surveillance and, in many cases, delivered the lethal strikes themselves. The USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group was deployed to the region, giving SOUTHCOM not merely counter-narcotics capability, but full-spectrum military dominance over a swath of the Western Hemisphere. In December 2025, Special Forces launched from the Ford seized a Russian-linked oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela, a maneuver that blurred the line between drug interdiction and great power geopolitics. The legal architecture supporting all of this was, to put it charitably, contested. The Trump administration relied on a memo from the Office of Legal Counsel arguing that lethal force against unflagged vessels carrying cocaine was permissible because cartel proceeds fund violence. The administration further formalized its authority on October 1, 2025, when President Trump formally declared to Congress that the United States was engaged in a non-international armed conflict with unlawful combatants under the drug cartels. This was not a declaration of war, but it carried enormous operational implications. It extended the legal logic of the post-9/11 counterterrorism framework, the authorization for use of military force, into the narcotic sphere. The cartels were no longer criminals. They were, in the administration's legal framing, enemy combatants. That legal reclassification had direct consequences. By late November 2025, the Cartel of the Suns, which U.S. officials allege is headed by Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, a claim Maduro denied, was designated a foreign terrorist organization. That designation unlocked expanded military authorities and sanctions tools. In December, the Trump administration designated the Maduro government itself a foreign terrorist organization and began a naval blockade of Venezuelan waters, directly targeting oil tankers carrying Venezuelan crude. The economic and military pressure escalated through January 2026, when on January 3rd, U.S. forces conducted strikes across Caracas and other locations and captured Maduro in a pre-dawn raid codenamed Operation Absolute Resolve, flying him out of the country. The Venezuelan government reported over 100 people killed in the broader operation. The administration framed it as the definitive strike against a narco-state. Critics called it something far more serious, the unilateral removal of a head of state with no international mandate, no congressional authorization, and no clear exit strategy. It was in this context, with Maduro captured, Venezuela destabilized, and Operation Southern Spear's naval campaign claiming over 150 lives, that President Trump signaled the next phase. In a January 9, 2026 interview, he told Fox News, "We've knocked out 97% of the drugs coming in by water, and we are going to start now hitting land with regard to the cartels." He named Mexico specifically, warning that the cartels are running Mexico. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum pushed back with characteristic firmness, declaring that no U.S. military action would occur on Mexican soil without her permission, and reaffirming Mexico's sovereignty in categorical terms. The diplomatic temperature spiked. The War Powers Act was invoked in congressional debate. Even the Republican-majority Senate passed a largely symbolic War Powers resolution seeking to block further unilateral military action in Venezuela. But the land phase did not begin in Mexico. It began in Ecuador. And it began with a partner, not a confrontation. Ecuador in 2026 is a country in genuine crisis. 6 of its cities rank among the world's 10 deadliest. The Ecuadorian government estimates that approximately 70% of global cocaine transshipments pass through its ports, a staggering figure that reflects the country's position at the nexus of Colombian and Peruvian production networks and the Pacific Maritime trafficking corridor that feeds North American and European markets. The 2 dominant criminal organizations operating in Ecuador, Los Choneros, aligned with Mexico's Sinaloa cartel, and Los Lobos, linked to the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, had transformed from street gangs into sophisticated paramilitary structures capable of challenging the Ecuadorian state itself. In January 2024, President Daniel Noboa declared a state of war against these organizations. He needed help. He wanted American help. The Trump administration had designated Los Choneros and Los Lobos as foreign terrorist organizations in September 2025, during Secretary of State Marco Rubio's visit to Quito, a designation made with Noboa's explicit concurrence and one that provided the formal legal trigger for expanded U.S. military involvement under counterterrorism authorities. In the days preceding March 3rd, Southcom Commander Marine General Francis L. Donovan traveled to Quito, meeting directly with President Noboa and senior Ecuadorian defense officials to discuss security cooperation and finalize operational planning. The diplomatic groundwork was thorough. The legal framework was pre-positioned. The military assets were staged. When the operation launched, Ecuadorian special operations units, including elements of the elite Brigada de Fuerzas Especiales, executed raids on drug facilities across multiple coastal provinces, with helicopter-supported strikes concentrated in the western corridor encompassing Guayas, Los Rios, Manabí, and El Oro. The U.S. role, as described by sources familiar with the operation, was limited to an advisory and enabling function. American Special Forces provided operational planning support, intelligence analysis, and logistical coordination. They did not participate directly in the ground assaults. The operation dismantled the transnational trafficking network of Hernan Ruilova Barzola, linked to the Los Lobos cartel. Ecuador simultaneously imposed a curfew from March 15th to March 30th across 4 provinces to impede gang logistics and restrict movement during the operational window. Approximately 10,000 Ecuadorian troops were reportedly involved across the theater, supported by U.S. ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, assets, including P-8 Poseidon Maritime Patrol aircraft operating from Manta Air Base, which Ecuador had quietly rebuilt with expanded naval facilities for U.S. personnel. General Donovan's public statement after the operation was deliberate in its framing. We commend the men and women of the Ecuadorian armed forces for their unwavering commitment to this fight, demonstrating courage and resolve through continued actions against narco-terrorists in their country. The language was important. Ecuador acted, the United States enabled. This advisory model, modeled on the special operations-centric approach used in the fight against ISIS in Syria and Iraq, provides Washington with significant operational leverage while maintaining a degree of legal and political insulation. It also critically sidesteps the sovereignty objections that would accompany unilateral U.S. ground operations. But the strategic implications of what occurred on March 3rd extend far beyond the Guayas River Basin. Several forces are now in motion that will shape hemispheric security for years to come. First, the precedent. The United States has now established in operational fact that the foreign terrorist organization designation of a drug cartel is sufficient legal predicate for U.S. military advisory operations on sovereign soil. The question every Latin American capital is now asking is, where does this end? The Sinaloa Cartel and Jalisco Nueva Generación, both designated FTOs, operate extensively in Mexico. Trump has signaled land strikes there. Colombia, despite its own complex history of U.S. counter-narcotics engagement, is watching carefully. Venezuela remains in open confrontation with Washington. The regional diplomatic architecture is under extraordinary stress. Second, the strategic alignment. Ecuador's cooperation is not incidental. It reflects a deliberate U.S. effort to cultivate willing partners across the hemisphere who can provide legal cover, operational access, and political legitimacy for an expanding military campaign. The Dominican Republic granted U.S. access to San Isidro Air Base. Trinidad and Tobago has engaged cooperatively. El Salvador, Panama, and Guyana have signaled political support for Operation Southern Spear. Washington is, in effect, constructing an informal security architecture, call it a coalition of the willing in the drug war, that operates outside NATO structures and traditional multilateral frameworks. Third, the global power dynamics. Russia and China have both been deeply invested in the Maduro government in Venezuela, providing military equipment, maintenance, training, and economic lifelines. The capture of Maduro and the destabilization of Venezuela represent a significant geopolitical setback for both Moscow and Beijing in their efforts to establish an anti-American foothold in the Western Hemisphere. The Royal Air Force provided surveillance and reconnaissance support to U.S. operations, tracking a Russian-linked tanker that was subsequently seized. The U.K. provided its naval supply ship RFA Tide Force to support U.S. seizure operations in the North Atlantic. NATO's European members are watching the precedents being set in the Americas with a mixture of unease and calculation. Unease because the abandonment of multilateralism and international legal norms that governs U.S. action in Latin America could, in time, be invoked by other powers in other theaters. Calculation because the demonstrated willingness to use sustained military force against non-state armed groups provides a template that could yet be applied to European security problems. Fourth, and perhaps most consequentially, the legal architecture itself. What the Trump administration has constructed is not simply a military operation, it is a new doctrine, already being dubbed by some analysts the Donroe Doctrine, a fusion of the Monroe Doctrine's hemispheric dominance logic with the post-9/11 authorization for use of military forces counterterrorism authorities. Under this doctrine, any organization designated a foreign terrorist organization anywhere in the Western Hemisphere becomes a legitimate military target. The proceeds of narcotics trafficking become an act of war against the United States. The U.S. military becomes the enforcement arm of that judgment. The implications for international law, for the UN Charter's prohibitions on the use of force, for the sovereignty protections that have governed interstate relations since 1945, are profound and unresolved. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has already called the maritime strikes extrajudicial killings. Bipartisan Senate and House Armed Services Committee investigations are underway. Civil rights attorneys have filed federal lawsuits on behalf of families of those killed, and yet the campaign continues to expand from sea to land, from Venezuela to Ecuador, from advisory roles to potential direct strikes. What we are witnessing is not simply a military operation against drug cartels. It is the opening phase of a fundamental reordering of how the United States defines its national security interests, its legal authorities, and its tolerance for sovereignty as a constraint on the use of military force in its own hemisphere. The cartels are real. The fentanyl crisis that has killed more than 100,000 Americans per year since 2021 is real. The violence that has made 6 Ecuadorian cities among the deadliest on earth is real. None of that is in dispute. What is in dispute, and what will be contested in courtrooms and congressional chambers and in the international arena for years to come, is whether the methods deployed are lawful, proportionate, and ultimately effective. History offers a sobering warning. Military force can degrade a criminal organization's immediate capacity. It has never alone dismantled the economic incentives that sustain it. The war on drugs has been declared before. The cartels have survived every previous campaign. What is different this time is the scale, the speed, and the willingness to shatter the norms that previously constrained American action. Whether that difference produces a different outcome or simply a larger, more destabilizing conflict with no defined end state is the defining strategic question of this moment.